and welcome to Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast with Renae Hanvin, which is all about inspiring you to start thinking and doing disasters a little bit differently too. In this episode, I'm talking with Tony Pearce, Victoria's first Inspector General for Emergency Management. And we're talking about the IGEM recommendations from the independent inquiry into the 2019 to 2020 Victorian bushfire season. A little bit about Tony. Tony was appointed Victoria's first Inspector General for Emergency Management in July 2014, an independent governor in Council Statutory Appointment. For 41 years, he has worked in intelligence, national security, emergency and crisis management, and has held a number of senior roles in both state and federal government, including 4 years in the national role of Director General, Emergency Management Australia. Now, I always like to start with where we met. So I met Tony over a decade ago when I was working at Australia Post. I attended a 2-day program where Tony was a guest speaker, and I was inspired by his holistic approach to disasters. We've managed a few coffees over the years, and I reached out again recently, given the launch of the Phase 2 report of the independent inquiry into the 2019-2020 Victorian fire season, which I'm glad to see has a big inclusion of businesses. Tony, so great to talk with you today. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Renae.
Now, let's start with what is the role of the Inspector General for Emergency Management?
Okay, so I guess just very shortly, I'll give you a bit of a history as to where we came from so as you can then understand what we actually are. We're effectively a product of a combination of the Victorian Bushfire Royal Commission following the 2009 Black Saturday fires, and then the floods review that looked at the massive floods in Victoria in 2010-11. And from both of those two events, there was a white paper process that government went through, recognising that the emergency management system hadn't functioned very well at all in either of the events. So went through the white paper process, consulted with communities, with the private sector, with government agencies and others, and asked the question about, in the perfect world, what would a new emergency management system look like if we turned it on its head? As a result of that, they came up with a whole range of answers to that. But within that, there were 4 changes to, or 4 additions, if you like, into the governance structure of the system as it was at the time. One of those was the creation of the Inspector General for Emergency Management. And the creation of that was a recognition by both the Royal Commission and also by Neil Comrie, who did the flood review, that one of the things that was missing from the emergency management system was a capacity for the system to be assured and to monitor and be monitored to ensure that the system was actually working as a system effectively. That is, that all parts were coming together, recognising where they sit within that bigger system, and were able to apply their elements of it for the greater good of the community in responding to these events. So as a result of that, the Inspector General for Emergency Management was created. The only thing I'd say that I found a little bit disappointing with it, I do find a bit disappointing with it, is I think Inspector General is probably not a good title for it, because it's something that sort of suggests that it's a punitive type organisation and people are going to come looking for you and find you and hang you up and blame you. That's not what we're about. We actually work collaboratively and cooperatively with everyone, because we have to keep going back event after event, working with them again. So it's in our best interest and theirs. Really, we've got 2 objectives in the Emergency Management Act that outline what it is that we're responsible for. One of those is to provide assurance to the government and the community about the effectiveness of the emergency management arrangements. And the second one is to foster continuous improvement of those. And because they're so generic and so broad in their wording, it actually allows us then to be very, very agile and flexible, if you like, about the types of things that we will do to deliver on those 2 objectives. Within those, or sitting underneath the 2 objectives, we've then got 12 functions, if you like, that are identified and articulated in the Act. However, they really fall into 5 broad category areas. One is that we're responsible for developing and maintaining an assurance framework for emergency management. So that is the framework that guides the way in which all levels of the system actually provide an assurance function, because it's not just IGEM's job. Everybody has a responsibility to assure themselves about the effectiveness of their operations. So therefore, it actually defines how you go about doing that, who's responsible for what, and it articulates the relationships, if you like, but then it also provides methodologies and tools and ways that you can go about doing that. So So that's the first one, and we did a refresh of that in 2018. If you go to our website, you can actually see the refreshed version on there. We also have an obligation to maintain what's called a forward plan of annual reviews, which effectively is the outline for the following 12 months each year of what I intend of my own volition to actually review. And that could be anything. We've done community preparedness for major emergencies. We've done incident control systems. We've done a whole range of things, but they're the ones that I'm doing that are always not in response to an emergency having occurred. They are just about looking at elements of the system, planning to do a review on those, and then coming up with some improvements in relation to those. The third part is conducting inquiries and reviews at the request of government. And these are the ones such as, for example, the review of the Victorian fire season, 2019-25 season. That was a request by government to do that. And that was obviously specifically in response to a major event having occurred. And we've had quite a few of those over the years. In that context, we've had the Wye River bushfires in 2015, Thunderstorm Asthma, which people would remember, where 10 people died in Victoria in 2016, and a number of others. So they are event specific, and they usually end up being accepted by government, and then that's where you will see significant amounts of money, et cetera, is put into the system to try and address those recommendations. We also monitor the implementation of any recommendation from any level of inquiry, including my own, parliamentary inquiries, royal commissions or otherwise, that have an emergency management relationship where government accepts those. And then it's our job to actually monitor each of those recommendations through to acquittal. And I'd say that's probably the most important thing we do in the big picture, is actually make sure that all recommendations are ultimately implemented or acquitted. And if they're not, that there is a legitimate rationale as to why they couldn't be or shouldn't be. And sometimes that happens over a period of years, because some of these things take years to implement. And then finally, the fifth category is the area of performance monitoring, where we have a responsibility, again, in legislation to monitor the non-financial performance, rather, of the Emergency Services Telecommunications Authority. And as you know, that's quite topical at the moment with call answer speed delays in ambulance, etc. So we work in that space. We're also monitoring Victoria's infrastructure resilience arrangements. That was again put into legislation in 2018 to make critical infrastructure, or make sure it's resilient. And we also investigate the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning planned burn breaches. And that is so when one of their planned burns gets away and actually becomes a bushfire, we are then responsible for conducting the investigation into that, independent of DELP, to make sure that the right outcomes are achieved in relation to ensuring that doesn't happen again. And there you go, a very potted history.
So, Tony, there's not much going on then. It's not a very big list.
No, not much at all.
Responsibility for. And I have to say, just obviously having known you for a number of years now, not only your experience in the sector, but just your passion for, delivering continuous improvement across the sector is something that I really value in our conversations. And I can't think of a better person to be in the IGEM role and have that oversight and view. Now, you and your team have led a number of reviews over the years and provided recommendations, which you've mentioned a few of them, that departments and agencies have implemented, all for bettering the emergency management sector. So what was this inquiry about, and when did it start, and why was there a phase 1 and phase 2?
Great question. Because it was a long inquiry, so sometimes people sort of think, oh, geez, why does it take so long to do something like that? If you look at the inquiry was actually about trying to understand. If you look at the way these fires rolled out over the period of time leading up to Christmas in 2019, and they'd been going in some areas sort of from around about late October. So we'd had quite a slow but consistent lead in of fire activity, and then of course all hell broke loose and the event took off, and then it took a significant amount of time to get on top of, and then to start getting into the process of recovering from that. And we saw quite a number of things occur that we've never seen before. So if you think about the mass evacuation of Mallacoota and those sorts of activities, along with a number of other things that occurred that we just hadn't seen in the past. So as a result of that, it was really almost a no-brainer. And I'd anticipated well ahead of January the 14th, which is when the Premier announced the inquiry, that we would get tapped on the shoulder and we would have to do something. So we were actually already, if you like, in the background from around November 2019, starting to gather information and data and evidence that was freely available, if you like, or visible to us without sort of burdening the agencies as such at that stage. And then sure enough, government came to me, they told me that they were going to get me to do it. And then the announcement was made on the 14th of January 2019. So that's way back when, if you like, and as you would be aware, because the phase two report has just been tabled in Parliament 2 weeks ago, that's when the inquiry finished. So some 20 odd months from start to finish, nearly 21 months from start to finish. The reason it was done in 2 phases was almost to recognise that. We knew it was going to be a very, very big inquiry, because it's quite simple to say, well, we want you to look at the preparedness leading up to and the response to the fires and then relief and recovery. That's 4 elements that you can say in a sentence without drawing too much of a big breath. But to actually do that and to do it properly, and then to do it justice with regards to identifying the improvement opportunities, we really need to split it into 2, because we were sort of fast approaching again the start of the 2021 fire season, if you like. And it was obvious to us that from a preparedness perspective and also a response perspective, we needed to get that work done hopefully by 30th of June, which was our plan, which we did in 2020, to allow government time to have a look at those recommendations, identify the low-hanging fruit, and be able to get a few things done before the 2021 season started. So that was the intention. And we also knew, as we all do, that recovery is a very long process, and it actually takes quite some time before you can start to get an understanding of what it is that's happening in the recovery environment. So there was really no urgency to attack that early on. So we put our significant focus for the first 6 months into the preparedness leading up to the season. That's both from a community and government perspective, and also then the response to the fire, again from both community and government's perspectives, and delivered that report as phase 1, which allowed government then to start doing some implementing, etc. As soon as we handed that over, we then kicked off, and we'd already been again doing some work in the background as we got closer towards the end of phase 1, but we officially kicked off phase 2, which is to look at the immediate relief arrangements and what did they deliver and how did they function in relation to the fire, and then of course into the recovery. And the important part of this is to acknowledge, obviously, that recovery is a very long process and it's different for everybody. It's very, very personal, and therefore it's moment in time. So I always like to say to people, don't look at this as being the be all end all of the recovery picture, but up to a moment in time, which is for most of those people who went through that event, some 15 months after the event. By then you start to get a pretty good feel for what's happening, and you can also really start to see where the system's working well or where it isn't. And that was the reason why that we actually broke it down into 2 phases. And as I say, I think we've been successful in delivering the recommendations in both, and they've all been accepted by government. Another point I'd just quickly make about the recs, if I could, is that I was asked, why is it that IGEM in Victoria came up with 15 recommendations in one report, 17 in another, that's 22 for your whole inquiry. New South Wales came up with 176 recommendations. Why was that? Does that mean that the Victorian inquiry wasn't done to the level of detail that it should have been? As I explained to people, when we look at these events, we have some benefits up our sleeve already. So, for example, it's just, to describe it as a benefit, it's almost callous, but it's not meant to be. The fact that the 2009 Black Saturday fires occurred meant there was a Royal Commission. Many of the things that the New South Wales inquiry picked up, Dave Owens and Mary in the New South Wales inquiry picked up with their work, were things that we had picked up as a result of 2009, not because we were smarter or better or otherwise, because that's when it happened to us. And therefore, that's when we were forced to confront reality and we identified the issues. So many of the New South Wales recommendations, if we'd gone back to 2009, would have been as applicable to us as they were to New South Wales. But in 2019, many of them weren't any longer. So therefore, we didn't look at a lot of the minutiae, if you like, about the way that equipment working on 2 trucks, that sort of stuff. That had already been done, so we didn't have to worry about it. So our recommendations were designed to be relatively high level and strategic, in that you can pick up a whole heap of smaller things underneath them if you implement that big recommendation at the top level. And that's pretty much why they played out the way they did.
And I mean, a massive project to deliver. And obviously with COVID on top of that, I remember seeing, the announcements and the connections into the communities, and a lot you had to obviously move to virtual, which normally would have been face-to-face. So, I mean, a massive job over that time to connect with and collect data and really understand the experiences from communities. Now, as you know, Tony, businesses, big and small, and business communities are my passion. And I was really glad to see a number of inclusions relating to this stakeholder group in the report. What were the main findings that came through relating to businesses and their role and contribution towards thriving communities?
Yeah. Look, before I sort of give you my thoughts on that, I think I'll make a comment a little bit about business too, because I think it's important to understand for those who aren't business owners, and some of those people might listen to your podcast, but for those that aren't actually business owners or business operators, um, all of the things that the broader community went through and all of the issues that impacted them impacted business owners as well. Unfortunately, on top of those things, then there were other things that were a little bit more specific to business. So business community, if you like, has more impacts on it. But the way that we look at it in the report, you won't see massive sections on business and business impacts, because it's a given already that many of the standard things that don't work well for communities actually don't work well for businesses either. So therefore, if you accept that the recommendations are designed to address those, and if government implements the recommendations, then a lot of the issues that impact business will be picked up, and then there are some specific things that are left over. So I wouldn't want people to read this and think, okay, well, they really didn't do 200 pages on business, and we know there was problems with communication, engagement, etc. That's already picked up in the recommendations anyway. So getting back to the more specifics, I guess engaging the business community was really the first thing for us. We weren't really quite sure how to do that in a way that it would give them the opportunity to actually speak to us just about their needs, because as I said, whilst it was important to acknowledge that a lot of business owners turned up at our broader community meetings, our face-to-face meetings, and they did mention business impacts, they didn't have enough time to focus on those because it wasn't just about them, if you like. So we picked up through that, but then we worked with the Small Business Commissioner's Office and a number of peak bodies to get the word out about the inquiry, what it was about, and to provide an opportunity. And unfortunately, because you can't, we did 63 face-to-face community meetings. So that's without the online ones, 63 in total across those 3 local government areas across both phases of the inquiry. So as a result of that, we saw a lot of and spoke to a lot of business people in those. Only one specific focus group meeting was about business, and that one was held in, I think it was in Bairnsdale, from memory. Bairnsdale or Orbost, can't remember. Quite a number of people turned up to it, which was great, but also we got a lot of feedback to say, well, that's no good because we can't, we can't all get to you in that one location. But obviously it was just not possible or practical to hold them in mass numbers just for business alone. So the public submissions, we got a hell of a lot of feedback from businesses in relation to through our public submissions, etc., and that was very helpful as well. Main issues, I guess, for business that we tried to ensure were both acknowledged in the report, but also that the recommendations would start to pick up, were that the fires were almost, if you like, the middle part of the event for business operators and the community, but for business operators, talking about them specifically now. I mean, we were coming off the back of a very significant drought throughout Victoria, and a lot of people in country Victoria and in businesses and in agriculture, etc., were impacted significantly by the drought, obviously. We then rolled into the fire season, and the fires occurred and did the damage that it did and introduced a whole range of new impacts. And then we rolled into COVID. So one of the big problems that we tried to acknowledge for business was that it's not just a single event that impacts on them, and government can't think about it in that way. You have to look at the environment in which business functions. It's an ongoing day-to-day proposition. It's a continuum of activity. It's not a one-off activity, being a business operator. Therefore, compounding emergencies impact on businesses on top of the way, in fact, that they impact upon communities. So there was and obviously for our perspective, there's an interest in making sure that was understood. Primary areas affected, as we identified, were obviously retail, tourism, and hospitality, but and they're the obvious ones because they're in those areas there is a lot of tourism activity. So there was a lot of vocalisation of the impacts on those types of sectors. But unfortunately, there were a lot of others who are primary producers. There are the groups who are actually working on the land, but because of their business model, structure, or because it's not their first income, are not seen to be primary producers, and yet they are earning an income through that. They are running a business, and yet they are not catered for in the same way as a primary producer would be, for example. So there were some parts of the broader business community that really weren't recognised, A, for what they do, and B, for the damage and the impact of the emergency on them. So that was problematic, and we were trying to make sure that was acknowledged in the report. And there's a whole range of issues that come around, state and Commonwealth governments, for example, they provided forums for business communities and the peak industry bodies and the industry leaders to discuss the economic impacts of the fires, which is really great, and to identify opportunities to support local and regional economic recovery. That's, again, a great thing to do. And they implemented and introduced a number of financial grants and those sorts of things that were provided to, obviously, to help these people through. However, the problem is that the very same things, in a broader sense, that impacted communities, so poor communication, poor engagement, not asking what it is that would most benefit business, rather giving them something and then expecting that they can actually use it and utilise it. Examples of people in some grant situations having the expectation that they would commit there and then to the ongoing sustainability of their business if they were given the grant. Well, of course, there's no way that any business, particularly the smaller ones, could actually say, well, we know we will be going in 2 years, 3 years' time. They needed the money, they needed the assistance to help them now to try and get them into a position to be able to know that they can move forward in the future. But it's, unfortunately, the way the grants are structured and so on at times, that didn't make it easy for them. So there was a whole range of things that impacted business communities more so than the broader community. Some of the negatives that arose through our investigations of this were, as I say, those businesses that sat outside of the tourism and accommodation industry, financial assistance and application opportunities seemed to be poorly communicated, and we heard that from everybody. So not everybody actually knew what was available. Often by the time they find out about it, it was too late, they'd actually missed it. If they did apply, a lot of the processes were extremely complex, and therefore, you're looking at people who have their families in turmoil, their private life and their residence is in turmoil, and their business is in turmoil, and you're expecting them to be able to sit down in a cogent way, be able to put together a very complex grant application or a funding application. You don't have to be Einstein to know that just simply doesn't work. And unfortunately, at times, the government systems are really not attuned to understanding the impact of those systems themselves on the ongoing recovery of businesses. So that's something that we focused on fairly heavy. There are often really lengthy delays in affected businesses actually getting their money, to the extent that quite a number of them have actually gone under. So they'd applied. By the time they got their money, they'd already folded, and therefore the money was of no value to them, and they couldn't come back from having folded in the way that they had. So that was problematic. And as I said, this need in some cases to say, well, yes, if you give us the money, then we will be a sustainable business ongoing, and that's a guarantee. That's just not going to work for people. So that was really problematic as well. I think it's, a bit of a summary to some of this is it's really important to acknowledge that the business community are also part of the broader community. So as such, as I said, many of the recovery issues that you as a resident, for example, or a live-at-home mother or otherwise might suffer, were suffered in the same way, but just in the context of a business trying to get through that process as well. So it's not, I find it sometimes, I think it's a shame that people think about. It's important to recognise business as a community that has to be considered properly. But by doing that, you've got to be careful too that you don't oversimplify the complication for them and forget that everything else that impacts the community impacts them as well as those additional items, if you like, or elements.
Oh, Tony, couldn't have said it better myself, clearly, because you've been in the, in the mix of talking with communities as well. And I think,
Yep.
That's how we see it as well. There's so much focus on preparing households, and that's absolutely, vital and fundamental. But businesses is a different approach. It's a different level of anxiety and stress, and it's a different level of preparedness. And we worked with Business Victoria maybe 12 months ago now on creating a disaster resilience for business toolkit, because preparing yourself and your household is one thing, but preparing your business is another thing. And we know when these disasters strike, we need businesses to safely keep trading. If anything, like we put the kids back at school when it's safe, we want the businesses to keep running when it's safe. And the grant, the disaster giving, there's a whole, I think, wicked problem relating to businesses and the role and the contribution they make into communities.
If I could, just before you go, I think another important thing in this too is it's often easy to overlook that just by having viable businesses in your community that can actually get back up again and start functioning, the image that portrays to the broader community and the confidence that builds in people in going, you know what, we actually are going to get through this and we can move forward, it can't be underestimated. And I think that's really important, that not only do they provide services in the midst of disasters if they can get going, But the very fact that they are actually up and running is a sign of confidence and something to give you a bit of hope that things will be good. And I think without using business in that way, you're undermining the value of them.
Yeah, 100%. And we've got a toolkit project that we're piloting in New South Wales, North and South at the moment. And one of the upcoming topics for that is My Community Needs Me. And it's all about really bringing, I guess, shining a light on the value of businesses, and not just from a goods, services, or even jobs perspective, but, you know, businesses, particularly small businesses, are really the economic and social heart of the communities.
Absolutely.
So if we keep them, you know, resilient, prepared, and able to adapt and keep trading, you know, it's great all round from a socio-economic, etc., resilience perspective as well. Now, you tapped a little bit on state government. So what role do you see state government could or should play in building resilient and prepared businesses for future disasters? Because this is a space that I guess I personally have been, you know, struggling a bit with, like, whose responsibility is it? Is it Business Victoria? Is it, you know, Emergency Management Victoria? And I'm just talking obviously about Victoria. But where does helping businesses to build resilience fit, do you think, in the state government level in Victoria?
Oh, look! It's got to. Well, it's already supposed to be a key component, but it has to be anyway. So, if you look at, for example, Emergency Management Victoria, they in their on all of their publications, when you see them talking about shared responsibility, etc., business and the community are mentioned in there. So, business is specifically identified in many areas of the state's emergency management arrangements as being a major stakeholder, and I guess. And you know, look, it's not that the business community is not necessarily engaged with. I think part of the problem is that because it's done on a sort of a sporadic basis. Sometimes it's because an immediate need is identified. So yes, people talk, but it's not done in the same way where you might say, well, local government is engaged ongoing. Other areas are the not-for-profit sector are engaged ongoing because they are contributors to emergency management systems. I think if, as business is not necessarily seen, and this is not only in this jurisdiction, in all jurisdictions, it's not necessarily seen as a major contributor to the emergency management system. It's seen as a recipient of the needs, you know, of the system, if you like. And if that were to change somewhat, I think you would then see a far greater engagement because, you know, addressing the issues that we identified in the inquiry and implementing those recommendations, both business specific and the community more broadly. So things such as engagement, important, you engage with communities. Communication, important, you communicate with them before, during and after emergencies to allow them to be able to be prepared, but also to get a sense from them about what is important to them and what their needs are and how they function and think and operate, which is very different to the community more broadly. Talking to them about funding management of grants, programs, cutting red tape, etc., and doing that all way ahead of the emergency and doing it as an ongoing engagement process, I think is probably one of the best things government could do. So it's not about looking at which individual agency could do something, whether it's a small business commissioner or otherwise. The collective of government agencies can collectively engage with the business community. There are lots of peak bodies, and in fact, if I use COVID as an example at the moment, COVID's a great example where I'm seeing significantly greater engagement with industry and the business sector than I've ever seen before by the state government. Absolutely, it is chalk and cheese to anything we've seen before. But when you look at what the pandemic is and the massive impact, which is everybody everywhere in our state is impacted by it, that's what's brought it to a head and caused it to be the way it is. I would love to think that one of the silver linings and the legacy of the COVID pandemic would be that government recognises, and I'm hopeful they will, but that government recognises that the very need that they saw in the midst of the pandemic to engage in that way is a need that is actually ongoing. And you don't have to do it that intensely, so as you are continuing to just simply talk to them day in, day out, 24 hours a day, but you do need to understand that there is a need for an ongoing dialogue with the business community and to use the peak bodies appropriately and to use the various other organisations that work with businesses to engage them. Because I think if government did that, that's probably one of the biggest potential benefits that you could see. And the other thing is, like in so many other areas, I think individual things that can be done. I don't think in the context of individual things that can be done, but more often from the perspective that those things that they'll all become evident if you partner with people. I think that's what it is. It's about saying, well, the business sector or the business community is one that the state's economy and our livelihoods cannot exist without our business community. Therefore, it's about a partnership between the business community and government more broadly. And if you get that partnership in place, then that's really important. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it's a one-way street. I've spoken to many business operators and some very senior ones too, who continue to poo-poo government and suggest that it doesn't matter what you do or otherwise, government will never come to the party. They don't know how to engage, and therefore we'll just continue to do what we're going to do. You can't go into the debate and the dialogue with that sort of an attitude. There's actually a responsibility on both sides to make this work. And I would suggest that COVID is a great example where the business community, through its representative bodies, is able to stand up and say, you know what, have a look at what we all did together because we had to through COVID. That now needs to be built into how we move forward in any other significant emergency. That's really important.
Spot on, Tony. And I guess that's, C2C. That's why I set it up. It's all about connecting businesses to communities, and, collaborations with government is certainly a key part of that. But I think COVID has absolutely flipped the switch in the sense of recognizing the value and the opportunity of involving businesses and the business communities in that shared responsibility of all playing a role. And how can we, activate or reshape business as usual so that we all are all more prepared, which is exactly, I guess, what C2C has been doing and running in a number of pilot projects, given that resilience is, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but finally on the agenda, whereas for a number of years before the bushfires and whatnot, just, it's not going to happen to me. So it kind of wasn't there.
Now, I think your comment just quickly, your comment about shared responsibility is important. It is absolutely that. You can't say as a government use phraseology like shared responsibility and then not actually engage people to allow them to contribute as a sharing partner. And just, the opposite of that is, as a business, you can't expect that you will be engaged and you will have opportunities be given to you and then you don't step up. You've actually got to step up and contribute to it as well. That way it is true shared responsibility.
Yeah. And I like to say it as shared responsibility, shared accountability, and shared, what's my other one? Collective input, I think. I can't remember, but basically we have
ownership's a good one for me.
Exactly. Yeah. We have to do something and be owners 100%. Now, in the phase 2 report that's just come out, the recommendation that everyone's talking about, lucky number 13, which is where we are obviously moving nationally with the new agency in other states. So can you explain why this is so key as a recommendation for the inquiry?
Yeah, look, I think I think the event itself was identified this without it wasn't exactly rocket science, I'd say, and it's important again, if I just start before I answer this one fully, to say that when you read the 2 phases of the inquiry, you'll find that the second phase, which is obviously about relief and recovery, you'll find that one is sort of probably more harsh and more critical, if you like, than the first phase was, and it's not that I did that. Well, it was deliberate, but it was meant to be done in a way that actually acknowledges the fact that relief and recovery really have never been looked at to any great detail in this state. So the Royal Commission dedicated 20 pages out of 4 massive volumes to recovery because its terms of reference weren't about recovery. They were about response and about planning and preparedness, rather. So we've never ever had a significant event that has had such a huge impact on the state where anybody has actually gone into this level of detail of reviewing the recovery system. So by definition, recovery has not developed at the same pace as preparedness and response have since 2009. So it was always behind the 8 ball. And as a result of that, you would have to have expected that the findings were going to be less than complementary compared to, say, phase 1. But that wasn't to suggest in any way at all that those who've been working in the recovery system since 2009 haven't been doing their absolute best that they could with what they had and the arrangements that they were working within. So it's really important to set that as the context. So then when we get to recommendation 13, obviously it wasn't too far, it was a while into the event, but it wasn't too far into the start of the recovery process that the need for a greater level of coordination, both in relief and recovery, that need was there. It was really, really very evident. And if you look at the recovery space, it has got a lot of players in it. Not that it shouldn't have, but it has got a hell of a lot of players at all levels of government, and then in the not-for-profit sector and a whole range of others. So there is so much activity going on all of it designed to help people get through and come out of the other side of what's happened to them in at least a sustainable way, if not a better way. But it's very, very poorly coordinated. The government parts of it are coordinated to an extent, but there is not the best degree of coordination across government, that's for sure. Once you then bring in outside all of the outside players, it becomes even more complex, and really the picture gets quite ugly from there. There's not necessarily agreement about principles of recovery, for example, and how a recovery system should work. People have their views, and it's not that they shouldn't have, and it's not that disagreement is a bad thing. It's just simply that there is no environment that's coordinated that allows people to have the debate, so as the system itself can identify what is the best we can come up with based on all of the differences that we have, so as we get a better outcome at the end of the day. So my thinking about this was that you have to have an organisation that is established in a permanent and ongoing way, recognising that it's not just bushfires that occur now. Yes, they might be a predominant hazard that is realised, but there are lots and lots of other things happen, and we've seen a number of them over the last few years that have broad-scale impacts on the state. So therefore, there needs to be an agency in place that is permanent, is comprehensively required to dedicate all of its effort to recovery management. It's got to have the authority to do that. It's got to have capability, capacity, and it's got to be resourced appropriately to coordinate the planning and the delivery functions of all emergencies. So that is the wording of the recommendation, if you like. What are the key bits there? Permanent, authority, coordination. They are the most important bits. And as I've said to others in the discussion about, so is that a statutory authority? Is it an organisation that sits within a department? Is it something different? My response to that is it actually doesn't matter to me what it is. We've articulated, in addition to just the 3 lines of that recommendation, all of the findings and the observations that sit behind that. And in fact, all of the findings and observations that sit behind all of the recommendations in phase 2 tell you what it is that this entity has to actually be able to manage. So therefore, if you put it in the government department and call it something, if it has the authority and the capability to do that, that's fine. If you decide that couldn't happen and you make it a statutory authority to allow it to do that, then that's fine too. I don't really care what the structure looks like, but what I will be monitoring very assiduously as we move forward is what it's actually achieving to make sure that the intent of every single one of those recommendations is actually being met. So that's why you have to have an entity, an organisation like that. The other thing is, I must admit, we didn't, even though we involved the National Recovery Agency and others in, and EMA and a whole range of others in our inquiry, I didn't take into account and wasn't considering their business and the way they go about their business when I looked at this. But of course, it's absolutely, it was implicit in my mind without having to be explicit in the report. But it's clear that if you're going to have something that is disparate, disconnected, uncoordinated in Victoria, and every other area or many other areas, including the national government, are moving towards a coordinated, well-processed organisation, if you like, then they're not going to be able to work together anyway. It wouldn't matter how much effort you put in at Victoria. If you are disparate and unconnected, then you can't engage with a central focused Commonwealth organisation, for example. So there's that part of it as well, which, as I said, was implicit in my thinking. But I would encourage people, if they're interested in that recommendation 13, not just to read the recommendation, but to read, even if you don't read the whole report, because it's 400 pages, so I wouldn't get you to do that. But I absolutely,
I have.
If you go online now, unfortunately for you, if you go online now, there's now an executive summary report. It's 100 pages that covers it all. But
you have to do an audio. You'll have to do an audio version podcast.
Yeah, but it's easier for people now if they want to have a look and understand. You can actually line up all the findings and observations with the recs and just read them in, together, and then it starts to make a lot of sense as to why this is really important. And you know what, Renae, it's an absolute no-brainer. There is no other way to go. And if I'd have made any other recommendation, it would not have been right. So it's clearly for me, it's the only way we can move forward. And I believe, and as I said, the government having accepted all of the recommendations is extremely positive to me, because I know that either, no matter how they structure it, it will work. But if it doesn't work initially, or I can see that it's not starting to work, I have the capacity then to influence that by the way I report on the implementation.
Well, I think without a doubt, we need a centralised agency that's there for all types of disasters, that's there long term, and it's not a reactive, I guess, pop up because something's happened. So I'm really excited. And again, it's a really, I think, important recommendation that's come out of it, but it just makes sense to where we are in the world. Now, I always like to ask my final two questions, or my final question is, what are the two things, and you've got to keep it to two, what are the two things you'd like to see done differently in the disaster space?
All right. I'll tell you three and I'll pretend it's only two.
Okay.
So, all right, because you like me. All right. So one of the things that we've alluded to a number of times in this, if we look at Victoria, as I say, we have pulled things together significantly over the 10 years, or now the 11 years rather, since Black Saturday, and we have a consistent approach to the way that we go about our business in Victoria. I mean, it can always be improved, and that's the very reason for having an IGEM and other organisations doing their own work. But I still think there's an absolutely desperate need for a nationally consistent emergency management system assurance mechanism. We've tried to, we've brought the whole country together, including New Zealand, as in IGEM did, to talk about this 2 years running to see if we could influence potentially other states, not having to have an IGEM. And this is not about me blowing our trumpet and saying how good we are, but the evidence shows very clearly by having a system level assurance mechanism in place, you get far better outcomes in the continuous improvement context. So I would love to see that. Genuine, diverse and inclusive engagement of all communities, howsoever you describe a community, I don't care, in the emergency management process before, during and after emergencies is absolutely critical. It's a human, and business falls into this as well. It's a human right. And the reason I say it's a human right is because everything we do, and if I think about IGEM alone, but all of the agencies too, but everything we do results in a consequential impact to the community. They will have to live with the recommendations that I make that government accepts. Therefore, it is unbelievable to expect that they should not be allowed to actually engage in the process of that decision making. And in an emergency sense, in the heat of the moment sense, if you'll pardon the pun, then them being involved in the before, during, and after process is absolutely critical in the same way. So I think that's it. And then the third one, because I'm being cheeky now, is really proper acknowledgement of the benefits of investing in preparedness versus having to continue responding to and recovering. We've heard all this before. Most of our emergencies are predictable, if not foreseeable. You may not be able to foresee when they're going to occur, but by Jesus, we know they are going to occur. So therefore, preparing properly for those, whether you are the business community, whether you are government, doesn't matter who you are, more effort has to go into preparedness. And we just don't do enough of it. We pay lip service to it. Every inquiry identifies that we weren't as well prepared. We should invest more. There's that much data around the world that shows you the financial benefit of doing it. And yet what happens? Every time something happens, we almost respond to it. And I'm talking in a generic sense, not just Victoria. We almost respond to the event like it's the first time it ever happened. And that's just madness. So if I had the big hat and I was the big bloke, I'd make those three things happen.
So I know what you did there, Tony. You were quite strategic, because if you'd said the first one last, I would have just stopped you on the first one, because obviously that is absolutely fundamentally what we're focused on too. But yeah, you can have three on that one. Tony, thank you so much for talking with me today. So I've been talking to Tony Pearce, Victoria's first Inspector General for Emergency Management, and we've been talking about the IGEM recommendations from the independent inquiry into the 2019 to 20 Victorian fire season. Can't wait to have a face-to-face coffee catch-up with you again soon, Tony. Thanks a lot.
Good on you, Renae. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
That's the end of this episode of Doing Disasters Differently, the podcast, which I hope you found to be relevant, informative, and inspiring. If you're interested in participating in the conversation or to connect with me personally, please visit corporate2community.com. Until the next episode, stay safe, and remember, we all have a role to play in thinking differently and doing differently before, during, and after disasters.